Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Elwood. You are watching The Political Vigilante. Very happy to bring returning guest back to our show, indie journalist Elizabeth Lea Vos. Elizabeth, how you doing today?
Doing pretty well.
Well, thanks for taking time to come back on the show. I wanted to bring you back on because it's actually been maybe 2 years now since you came on to talk about the Finders cult. And you have a new article in Mint Press News. And initially, when you came on the show 2 years ago, there was no direct links to the CIA as of 2 years ago with the information. We knew that the FBI was involved in it, or we suspected maybe the CIA. We definitely knew the FBI was involved. We saw the big cover up. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Finders cult, go back into just do a search, Finders cult. That we did several videos on this, and you have new information that is pretty startling. I just want to bring up for the audience to see real quick your article in Mint Press News for everyone to look at. The buried documents that link the infamous cult to the CIA. Why label intelligence reports secret, then lie about it if no evidence of criminal activity or an intelligence-led cover-up existed? So why don't you, first of all, just give our audience, if there's anyone out there who's not familiar with the Finders cult, what you uncovered several years ago that we discussed, and then what this new information is, just sort of bring everybody up to speed.
Sure. So it's a complicated story, and there are multiple stages of it, basically. So initially you had in February 1987, this incident where there were two men in Tallahassee, Florida, arrested with 6 very dirty, unkempt, hungry children. They gave evasive answers to the police that the police did not buy at all. So the police, initially thought, rightly so, that this could be a situation of kidnapping and child trafficking across state lines. So this basically multi-state, multi-agency investigation was started at that point. And that then led to searches of Finders cult locations, because they quickly realized that these men were part of the Finders group. The locations then were searched by Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, and there were also Finders properties in Virginia that were searched. And according to the documents I discussed in the second article, there was evidence of criminal activity that was found that then essentially disappeared. The evidence was not available for review. And the explanation given to the customs agent who wrote these documents, Ramon J. Martinez, he says that an off-the-record statement from a third party at the MPD was to the effect that the entire investigation had essentially been called off, that the subject had been labeled a CIA internal matter, and that no more investigation was going to be done. And basically, up until recently, there wasn't a whole lot other than these customs documents, which were the central kind of focus of this second article, to go on. So you had allegations, you didn't really know what to believe, and there were some FOIA documents that slowly kind of came out over time. But eventually in 2019, which was, I believe, a few months after our last discussion, so at the time of our last interview, this FBI Vault publication had not been made public. So in, I believe, October of 2019, the FBI starts publishing hundreds of documents to the Vault under the topic, the heading of Finders. And I hesitated to cover it initially because I saw that as soon as I'd gotten done reading the first set of documents, they had another set that came out. And then a few months later, they had another set. So I wanted to wait until it seemed like they were done publishing things before really, diving into it in a public way. But I've been keeping an eye on it for a long time. I contacted Ramon Martinez in 2017, but at that time he wouldn't go on the record at all. He did talk to me though, and he did confirm that the customs documents are genuine, that he wrote them. He discussed, I think I talked to him for about an hour, but it was off the record. So
and I should interject here just for our audience. So this customs agent, Ramon Martinez, because why he was brought involved is because, transporting kids across state lines is a brings in the Customs and Border Agency. And he was the one who discovered a lot of this stuff. And then I remember we even went through his reports and documents that you brought on the show last time. And then they did that classic thing of they started smearing him and, oh, he's a loose cannon or crackpot or whatever. So to discount any of the evidence, and he was just a criminal investigator. He had no axe to grind. He was just a criminal investigator. And that's, again, what raised a lot of the red flags in your reporting of 2 years ago. So people should know that. This is why this these red flags kind of keep stacking up. And I remember reading his reports going, and I even talked to my friend who was a former child crimes investigator about this. And he's like, yeah, this guy did exactly what an investigator would. He goes, well, this is what I would have done, you know? So I wanted to interject that. So that's to give people, like, that's part of this, why there's like, wait a minute. And what was discovered with, you know, when we had you on the show was just really awful stuff, you know, videos and pedophile, sex trafficking, videotaping it, potentially even impregnating women and then selling their children, right? There was that kind of horrific stuff was happening.
They were doing everything in their power to produce children, whether that, and Martinez writes that was including impregnating the female members of the finders, kidnapping, trading, purchasing. And you also had what's really interesting. So to add on to Martinez, basically what the vault documents did was, on their face, if you read them just kind of skimming through it, you see a lot of refutation of him, like a lot of investigators saying, oh, I didn't see that, and I didn't get interfered with by the CIA, so clearly there's nothing to see here. I don't know what this guy's talking about. But you actually also see corroboration of him. So, for example, in his documents, he says that the finders were trying to kidnap children, that they were scouting daycare centers, they were cataloging information on private families that had nothing to do with the finders in terms of membership. And in the FBI vault documents, you have this one report by the Washington Metro Police Department describes an interview with a woman who they called because she and her children's information were found in the finders documents. And the reason was that she had almost used them as a babysitter. So there's this corroboration that they were interested in children, in families. And the explanation of the finders as some sort of kooky alternative living community really falls apart if Martinez is at all credible. And I believe that he is, based on what I've seen in these documents, and also based on the FBI vault documents. You have Martinez saying that at the end of the initial 87 investigation, that he says, quote, the MPD report was labeled secret. The FBI vault documents try to say, oh no, the case file wasn't labeled secret, so he's wrong. But actually, he didn't claim the whole entire case file was secret, just the report. And there are multiple reports by the MPD that are secret. The synopsis is labeled secret. Multiple different reports are secret, as are the FBI field office, the Washington Metro field office documents that cover those reports. So when they're doing their inquiry, which came later in 1993, we haven't talked about that yet, but basically there was so much controversy around the initial 87 investigation going nowhere that eventually the Department of Justice said, okay, well, let's do an inquiry about whether there was a CIA cover-up. And the fact that they were pushed to do that says a lot. But of course, you know, they didn't just investigate it themselves. They didn't ask hard questions. They literally handed it off to the FBI, who then handed it off to the Washington Metro field office, which was working with the MPD during the original investigation. So you don't have a neutral third-party organization to begin with. But what the Washington Metro field office does is it labels their own synopsis secret as well when they're going through this process. So in multiple ways, Martinez is corroborated by these documents. We also have admissions like the cult's leader's wife, Marion Petty was the leader, but his wife, Isabel Petty, was admitted to have been a CIA employee from 51 to 71. And it was her passports, apparently, that were to North Korea, North Vietnam during this Vietnam War and the Cold War era, to Moscow, to a lot of places that you would not be able to reach. I mean, North Korea, you can't even get into now, much less then. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in the new evidence now that you know, when we spoke 2 years ago, it was more of an insinuation that the CIA was probably involved, but the new documents now point to a much more clearly defined involvement.
I would say so. I would say that the documents, I mean, let's say just take as an example, let's just hypothesize for a moment that this really happened, that this was a CIA cover-up and all of that. I doubt that the FBI would be eager to publish documents that would really show that. So you have to remember, when you read through these hundreds of documents, they are heavily redacted. There are lots of privacy exceptions to FOIA releases, but some of them, some really significant redactions, are labeled secret. So we're not getting the full picture. But for example, the FBI documents do include a couple of reports that are included in that collection of reports that we went over years ago that is discussed in this article, but they redact them. They summarize them, and the entire second report that Martinez wrote is omitted. It's not even there. So you have to remember that you're getting a really filtered view from these documents. But even so, even with that filtered view, there are significant corroborations of Martinez. We also can see from those records that it was, we know now who he was talking to, who informed Martinez that it was a CIA internal matter, that it had been basically covered up. That was a Metro Police Department detective who was named Sergeant Stitcher. And he was, by the time of the 1993 inquiry into the original investigation, he had passed away, apparently of septic shock. So if he had lived, I think that there's a very strong chance that he would have corroborated what Martinez had to say, because he was the one that told him. So we know that from the documents that he was the one that told him. And in the documents, it includes, again, redacted statements where he says that the CIA had been monitoring the investigation from the beginning, that the MPD's investigation was stepping on their toes, and a couple of other things that are really significant. So,
wow. I mean, and this. It also an interview I did 2 years ago with John Kiriakou, who said that he's a CIA whistleblower, who said that the CIA wouldn't flat out say, go get children for somebody. But if you did that to get leverage on an informant, they wouldn't say, hey, don't do that again. They just say, okay, you did whatever you had to do. Like, they're not going to stop you. They're not going to say, go do that, but they're also not going to say, stop. Now, this supports, that corroborates what you're saying. But also, this evidence sounds like it's way more the CIA was like running or funding this cult, or especially when you say that woman was in the CIA. And I remember we discussed that 2 years ago, how they had access to all these North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Like, how could you get in there if you're just a regular old American, and all this other stuff? And North Korea, you said, and the Soviet Union, how would they get access to this? So it really almost seems like, what do you think? Do you think, and based on your evidence, that this cult started operating and then the CIA went, oh, well, we could use this to our advantage? Or do you think that, or does the evidence suggest that the CIA flat out started this cult to do this?
Well, I think making those statements are very hard to make. They're very hard to make factually from what we have, because with anything related to the CIA, it's extremely convoluted. And I said this in the first article I wrote about this, that this particular case has a lot. It's kind of like a hole of mirrors. Like, you look at one thing, you think, oh, wow, that's really damning. And then you get more information that makes it almost look like that was a ruse. It's really, really complex. And the other thing that makes it more difficult is everything that we've talked about so far actually doesn't have it. It's not that it doesn't have anything to do with, but it doesn't even focus on, for example, the children recovered in Tallahassee and whether they were abused or not. So there are a lot of different facets of this investigation and the subsequent inquiry and the documents that have come out since that are very, very damning, but then have at least a level of plausible deniability. And that makes it very hard to say anything with certainty. And also, there are multiple different ways that this could have happened. For example, Marion Petty, the cult leader, said he was an Air Force sergeant, I believe, and he was working, he was, I believe, part of, World War II and all of that. And his cult followers, specifically Toby Terrell, I believe, stated that he was a chauffeur for a lot of very high-ranking generals and that kind of thing. There's a great documentary that was done in early 2019 by the Conscious Resistance's Derek Brose. So if people want to know more about that, because he did an interview with Toby Terrell that was really interesting. where, you know, Terrell obviously denies any wrongdoing by the finders, but he also corroborates some information about Marion Petty's origin story and his connection with military and military intelligence. So Derek Burrows is definitely a guy to check out as far as his work on this. Another person whose work is really interesting on this is Nick Bryant, who wrote a really great book on the Franklin scandal. And he actually was turned on to the Franklin scandal and took it seriously because he witnessed and he was looking into the Finders case. So he's another
scandal.
The Franklin scandal is its own. It's another can of worms. Where basically it was in Omaha, Nebraska. There were allegations again of CIA tied child abuse, mind control, child trafficking, and it was all related to. It was tied in with Iran-Contra. Whitney Webb's touched on it a little bit in her discussion and investigations of Epstein, that there are some figures involved with Epstein that tie back to that. So, and it's all in the same era. So, again, it's very difficult to state, like, you know, the CIA founded this organization or the organization was kind of co-opted by the CIA. But what I can say, and what I think that is backed up by the evidence, and there's a lot, and for example, I just want to add that there's so much information to go over that I had to spend 4,000 words just writing about one set of documents that were the customs reports. I'm going to have to go write more articles to look into and explain some of these other aspects of it, like going in depth on the CIA ties, going in depth on assessing the allegations of child abuse, and specifically the child abuse allegations relating to Tallahassee. So, but what we do see in the FBI vault documents is that the finders are assessed as having started as a hippie group. Kind of, you know, if you think of the Manson family, like a hippie, very alternative lifestyle community is the way they like to describe it, where they're just kind of, and they're running these games that are led by this game caller, Marion Petty. And he would tell them things like, okay, I want you to go to XY country or state and make such and such amount of money and come back. I don't care how you do it. You leave with nothing. He would reportedly try to basically make his followers act like children, like think like children, in order to achieve whatever these games were that he was playing. But what we see in Martinez's documents is that these games are much more like spy operations, that they're labeled operations. There's operations labeled Pentagon break-in. They're interested in terrorism and explosives. So whether they began as a CIA operation or whether they developed or were co-opted into one is something that I don't think can be determined with the evidence available, but that there was an intelligence link, that they were acting much more like a spy ring than a hippie commune is, I think, undeniable. And there's a whole lot more to that, and just the way in which they would play off, you know, these really blatantly awful things they were doing, like having the kids sleep outside. They weren't allowed indoors. They weren't being fed except as rewards, which sounds a whole lot like, you know, operant conditioning and that kind of thing. And I mean, the fact that these kids weren't taken from the situation simply on the term of neglect is insane. So.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, trying to figure out, did they create it? Did they? Yeah, you're right. There's not enough evidence, but there is enough evidence to say they knew that they were involved in this in some way or capacity. They didn't just like stumble across it and go, "Oh, this is awful. We should shut it down, but keep it quiet." There's no way.
And let me add one thing that I wanted to say that I forgot. But basically, there was a customs document as well that was never published, that has it. Well, it was never publicly released, let's say, but it was quoted by a journalist named Paul Rodriguez in the Washington Times in 1993. And it basically stated, it quoted Martinez, it quoted the customs documents that we have available now, but it also quotes a document that we don't have that states that the Finders Group was a CIA front gone bad. So that's the way it assesses it. And that article has been scrubbed from the internet. You can find a copy of it in the FBI vault documents, and you can find a copy of it on Scribd, but you can't, it's not like on any archive. It's not available. It's the one article that actually quotes Martinez, and it's the one that's been completely removed. But
yeah. And again, why would you need to remove that article if there wasn't truth in it?
right.
Well, let me ask you this. So has anybody in all this time, with all these documents coming forward, has anybody been arrested, prosecuted, done jail time at all?
No. The charges against the two men in Tallahassee were dropped. There were no, basically all of the investigating agencies concluded that there was no evidence of criminal activity on the part of the finders to investigate. And eventually the preliminary inquiry assessed that there was not only no indication of criminal activity, but there was also no indication of any type of cover-up. And yeah, the fact that they would be able to assess that based on even just the condition of the children that they recovered in Florida is ludicrous on its face. And then if you take into account what Martinez says that he saw, it's also very disturbing. And the thing is that they're able to get away with saying that. They're able to have that as a narrative because the evidence that Martinez witnessed, which is what is so crucial, because that's the evidence of this intent to traffic, intent to kidnap, intent to purchase children, sometimes from overseas, from contacts in foreign governments, like from China. All of that evidence disappeared. Martinez wasn't able to review it. And so the FBI vault documents go to efforts to say, oh, well, because there was no evidence of criminal activity, and Martinez is basically making this up, the material was returned to its owners and or destroyed. It has conflicting reports on exactly how that happened, because it also says, oh, well, we sent the evidence to Tallahassee for their investigation. And Tallahassee's like, well, no, they returned it to the owners up in DC. And it goes into a bit of conflict there on the details. But not only do we not have the evidence itself when the 1993 inquiry happens, we also don't have any descriptions of the evidence. And even the FBI vault documents, the WMFO, Washington Metro Field Office, admits that. They say we have no descriptions. We have an MPD officer telling us that photographs were taken of the evidence, that detailed intake forms were filled out, and yet we don't have it. And MPD won't send us anything except the actual search warrants, which had very bare bones descriptions of like assorted papers, assorted photographs, no description of what those documents said or what the photographs were of. That's all we have.
Have any of these kids come forward now that they're adults? I mean, this was like 20, 30 years ago. Have any of them come forward and say, yeah, I was abused or trafficked or whatever?
No, and that's another one of the aspects of this case that makes it so difficult to cover. And I think it's one reason that a lot of journalists, even independent journalists, haven't. And I mean, that's a really huge, significant aspect of it is these kids did not come forward as adults and say, hey, I was trafficked. In other child abuse cases like Dutroux in Belgium, for example, I don't know if your audience is familiar with that, but basically you had similar organized child trafficking allegations. But in that case, you had at least 10 victims come forward and allege really, I mean, outlandish claims like about ritual abuse and all of this really horrendous stuff. And they were called crazy and all of this, but they did come forward. So in this case, you don't have adult victims with allegations. You don't have a lot of the type of information you would hope to go on as a journalist to kind of chase down some leads and verify this information. But you do have enough official documentation to raise these questions. And so.
Yeah, the documents are, there's a lot. That's like massive smoking guns. Wasn't there, correct me if I'm wrong now, because it's been 2 years since we talked about this, wasn't there like human or child remains found at the site? No, there was not.
No,
okay.
But there were in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, there were a number of rural properties that the finders had. There was a rumor to the effect that there was a murder that took place at the hands of the finders, and just like the evidence of child trafficking, that was basically a dead end as far as the vault documents are concerned. They have witness statements that say a finders member passed away on finders property due to lack of medical intervention. You have two different stories on how that happened. One story is that she got sick and for religious reasons chose not to get medical care and died. The second story from another witness that's in the documents says that she was trying to leave the finders, she was physically restrained, then became ill, and they didn't get her medical attention. And that death was never investigated by authorities. So you just have nothing to go on. But they did not recover bodies at the rural properties. But they did, according to Virginia State Police, in the FBI vault documents, they found cages that witnesses said children were kept in when they were on the property.
Yeah, so there's no kids that have ever been released or recovered or saved or anything like that, and there's no adult kids coming forward, and no one's been charged with anything.
And we
And
don't know how many kids they had, because in the customs documents, basically Martinez also says that there were messages telling finders members to move, quote, the children in the night after this incident happened, before the search warrant was in effect at those properties. They had already gotten information that it had happened. They were highly technologically they were ahead of their time technologically. So they had an early kind of version of the internet where they were connecting computers together. So they found out very, very quickly about the arrest, and they were telling each other, move an unknown number of children. And they had instructions on avoiding police detection and continuing to move through different jurisdictions. So again, so we don't know how many children they actually had custody of at the time.
In your conversations with the customs officer, Ramon Martinez, does he ever expressed any like, I'd like to get this reopened, or is he just, do you feel like he's been threatened and smeared so much that he's kind of like, I don't want to talk about this anymore? Or what was your sense in your conversations with him?
I think, well, I mean, again, the conversation I did have in 2017 with him was off the record, but he at least was willing to talk with me off the record. Now, when I reached out again recently to speak with him, I mean, he had been through a lot, and he basically said, I'm not talking to absolutely anybody about this story ever again. I want nothing to do with it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, you know, he has had a very strong negative repercussion in his life for writing what he did. There's a whistleblower complaint that he wrote that a researcher gave to me that was really enlightening, basically illustrating how he was punished within the customs, service for what he'd done, specifically not only writing the document, but also for cooperating with the media in that inquiry and some congressmen that were interested in the case. So, yeah, he's not somebody who got any sort of positive, attention or result from this. I would say that he sacrificed a lot as a result.
I mean, that's just like, this is just kind of standard. I mean, this is what they do. This is what they did to Gary Webb. I mean, this is just what they do. They just smear people into like submission, or they commit suicide by shooting themselves in the head twice, like Gary Webb did. So it's just like, I mean, has there been, since this latest article of yours has come out, has there been anybody in Congress or whatever saying, oh boy, we should reinvestigate this? Is anyone?
No.
No, not at all.
No, of course not. And I mean, in 2019, when the Vault documents came out, there was a lot of attention, I think, from the alternative media community around it. But the interesting thing is, the only corporate media article that covered it that I'm aware of at the time in 2019 was a Vice article that called it the case the ground zero for the Pizzagate and QAnon conspiracy theories. And the entire article was just basically like, if you're interested in this, you're an alt-right conspiracy theorist, and look no further. So
yeah, and that's I talked about it on the show. That was my fear, and it's been realized after the January 6th Capitol attack that they're going to just use that, which was awful, and there should be investigations, but they're going to use that as like anything they're going to just call a QAnon. Any video about Epstein, you're a QAnoner. Finders called, you're a QAnoner. You're just some wingbird Pizzagator, which is what, having covered the Epstein stuff now I just did another video on it for 2 years. This is their main thing. And it's like when people go, well, how does this happen in plain sight? Well, it's the most powerful people in the world are doing this, and they can sway the public perception. I mean, obviously QAnon is a psyop, a very effective one. And, that's why there is no invest. That's why any story, I mean, there's just a couple new stories that came out about Ghislaine Maxwell. Her deposition is going to be allowed, but in the mainstream media articles, there's nothing about the Clintons, the Trumps. I mean, any of these powerful people, Les Wexner, none of it. And that's their goal. Is like, if this is discussed, it's discussed in this like sort of narrow little framework. And then of course there'll be an article that says, oh, finders, it's another pizza QAnon wing, but they just lump us all into this. And this is a CIA tactic when they coined the term conspiracy theorist after the JFK assassination. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Like, so anyone's considered just a crazy person, you know? So, man, I mean, it's just like, I usually like try to give my audience like action, like do this or call this person. I mean, I guess you could call your representatives, but what's that going to do if they're all just kind of spoon fed by the CIA on what to say or not to say, and they're all afraid of them? They're never going to step forward.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I mean, Ramon Martinez, you asked earlier, you know, what's his perspective? He did have some communication with Derek Burrows of the Conscious Resistance, and basically it was very similar to what he told me, which is there are never going to be convictions. There's never going to be prosecutions. And for somebody in law enforcement, that's kind of your goal. I mean, that's if there's not going to be a prosecution, an investigation, a conviction, what's the point of talking about it further, right? But I think that the act of discussing it in a factual way, to me, I mean, that does something. It's transformative in some way. If for no other reason, then you know, the people who have been through some type of organized child trafficking, you know, they don't feel as invalidated as they might otherwise be when there's an absolute blackout of discussion around this that's serious and that takes it in a way that isn't just a propaganda narrative. Whether that propaganda narrative is you're a QAnoner to look if you look into it, or whether that propaganda narrative is QAnon, which is kind of co-opting the whole thing and making it radioactive for the rest of us to look at. So,
yeah, that's perplexing. I mean, it's well, yeah, I'm just sort of at a loss here because it's like so profound what you have uncovered. And then it's like deliberately, it's like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they just kind of put it in that giant warehouse.
Right, exactly. Good.
You know, good luck for watching, everybody. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button. Go to patreon.com/Graham Elwood and rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, where you can support the show. Also, I have a Bitcoin wallet, a Bitcoin Cash wallet, and an Ethereum wallet in the show notes. We're taking cryptocurrency. I have a Coinbase affiliation link. We're going to be getting on some other exchanges. So that's how you support the show. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. YouTube is unsubscribing us at an alarming rate. I have a PayPal button at grahamelwood.com. I even have a Venmo at Graham-Elwood. There's a lot of ways to support our show. We are getting crushed by YouTube. We've dipped under 73,000 subscribers because of YouTube. Thanks for supporting what we do.